percentage of feeding, at the age at which the percentage of feeding of an offspring is similar to the adult. It's about 5.8 years in Borneo and a bit longer on Sumatra. The same for moving. The percentage that when they're not clean anymore, or when they're not clean anymore on Borneo, it's 5.8 years. On Sumatra, it's a lot longer. They cling to their mom when they have to cross difficult gaps in the forest a lot longer than they do on Borneo. They also tend to stay in close association with their mom a lot longer than they do on Borneo. And on Sumatra, they sleep in their own nest at a later age than on Borneo. So all these indicate that the development on Sumatra might be slower than on Borneo. If you look at weaning age, you find the same. On Borneo it's 5 to 6 years, and on Sumatra it's a little bit longer, again suggesting that development on Borneo is faster than that on Sumatra. And I'll come back to this because some of you might be thinking, why is this the case? People that were thinking about the dietary differences were also quickly thinking about morphological differences. For instance, would there be a difference in dental morphology? And Ushida did a lot of good work comparing all that and did not find any differences. So people were like, oh, maybe diet would not have a large difference on their morphology. Then Andrea Taylor went through almost all the museums that have orangutan skulls from all the, basically the hunters that were collecting animals for the big natural history museums in Europe, in the US, and measured all these different things from their jaws, so how wide they were, how long they were, how thick they were, and found that if you look at the jaws of the orangutans on Borneo, they tend to be more robust than those on Sumatra. So they're thicker, and that might have to do with, for instance, the inner bark that they eat and the amount of vegetable matter that they eat. Both are quite hard; they're tougher to eat than soft, juicy fruits. So maybe, therefore, the orangutans on Borneo have these more robust jaws because they have to do a lot more soft chewing on harder food items. Interestingly enough, she also measured cranial capacity and found that the most pronounced difference was between the orangutans on East Kalimantan. They had, here this is a measure of cranial capacity, and here are the subspecies, species, and the ones in East Kalimantan seem to have smaller cranial capacity than all the other ones. Again, the sample size is not that large, but it's large enough, and especially for females, even with the variation that you see, they appear to have really a smaller cranial capacity than the other. So that's a very interesting difference, especially because it relates nicely to the interbirth interval, where morio has a very short interbirth interval, so they develop very quickly, and they have a somewhat smaller brain. Wurmbii develops a little bit less quick, and they have a little bit of a larger brain. And on Sumatra, where they develop really slowly, they also develop the largest brains. This definitely needs more work, but it's very interesting to think about it and whether these small differences in brain capacity or in brain size would actually have implications for what they do in the rest of their life. Do they learn faster? Do they learn differently? What does it actually mean? What we think is going on is that when you grow fast on a diet that's not so good, you try to economize on your brain, because brains are an extremely costly piece of machinery. They take up a huge amount of your metabolism. So a lot of the energy that you take in goes to your brain. So if you can economize on brain size and a bit of a smaller brain, that might work better. And in addition, if fruit is not, or if good food is not always available, you might also want to change your growth patterns. So let's summarize some of the variation that we've seen. Density is highest on Sumatra. They're also the most social orangutans. Their diet seems to be more stable. The reproduction on at least the one side in Sumatra seems to be less depending on fruit availability. The age of first reproduction seems to be similar for what at least we know from these two sites. Development on Sumatra seems to be slower than on Borneo. The jaw morphology is more robust on Borneo, and there seems to be this little difference in cranial capacity. How can we try to explain this? Well, we think it has to do a lot with the availability of fruit. And over the past also 18 years, we did a lot of work on trying to measure fruit availability in various different ways, and we'll go through some of those to try to determine how it could potentially influence all those variables here. We'll first go to what is really a unique phenomenon for Southeast Asia, and that's masting. Masting is the phenomenon where if you go into a forest, almost all the trees have fruit of most of the species that you find in a forest. And that means that it's a great time for all the animals there, because there's just a ridiculous amount of fruit available. So all the fruit that's coming from far away, the apes that have large home ranges come into areas where there is masting, and everybody seems to be doing fine. The big problem for animals that they have to cope with is that in between the mast, there's hardly any food. During the mast, there's like more than 15% of the trees are fruiting. Between the mast, there's hardly anything. So how, as an animal, do you cope with these things? So we thought, well, maybe the frequency of these masts differs between the different islands. So we collected a lot of data from a lot of papers and from our own data, and we tried to combine everything, and we didn't find any difference. So we were like, well, okay, that's probably not what explains some of that variation. Let's move on to the fruit availability that is on average available in these forests, and how people measure that is you go to a forest, you make a plot or a transect, you measure from a certain amount of trees above a certain size every month how many fruits there are, and then you can calculate the percentage of trees that are carrying fruits every month. And if you do that for two sites in Indonesia, one in Borneo and one in Sumatra, what you see that on Sumatra it's quite a bit higher than on Borneo on average, and even in the dips, the periods where there is a little bit of fruit on Sumatra, it's still higher than it is on average in Borneo. And in Borneo again, there's this long period where there's hardly any food available. If you look at this for 3 of the main habitats that orangutans live in, and do this for a lot of different sites, then you still find that the Sumatran sites, on average, have a higher fruit availability than most sites on Borneo. Not all Sumatran sites, there are a few sites that have only a little bit or a little bit less fruit availability, but on average it's higher than in Borneo. If you then look at the food that's available outside of these fruit peaks, again for many sites, here this is the percentage of trees that have the percentage of months where there's only less than 5% of trees fruiting. You see that it's lower on Sumatra and on Borneo, indicating that there's on average, even outside of the fruit peaks, more food available on Sumatra.